Next up, we will hear from health industry experts and patient advocates. When presented with a one-time breakthrough therapy, how are issues related to pricing, access, and affordability tackled? To answer this key question, I am pleased to welcome on stage Tom DeLenge, President, Advocacy Law and Public Policy Division at the Biotechnology Innovation Organization, Paul Brayshaw, a hemophilia patient and former president of the Hemophilia Federation of America, Steve Miller, Chief Medical Officer of Express Scripts, and Gregory Daniel, Deputy Director, Duke Margolis Center for Health Policy at Duke University. And the Hill's editor, Kim Dixon, will be leading this conversation. Kim, over to you.
Thank you. Thank you all for coming. I'm not sure if this panel could be more well-timed, given the FDA approval last month of the first gene-based therapy, which I think the New York Times called a new era in medicine. So our panel has a broad swath of perspectives on this. Why don't we start with, from the patient perspective, Paul, defining a cure. Is $475,000, is that a good deal?
It depends on if I'm paying out of pocket. If my insurance company is paying, I think it's a great deal. I think that the idea of me not having to infuse, I have to do self-infusions, IV infusions, is a big difference, and it makes it worthwhile. And I think also the future of reduced comorbidities makes a big difference in my quality of life.
But there are challenges to the system, Greg. We talked about how it's not designed for cures, which is sort of ironic. You would think that the healthcare system would be designed for cures, right, and not for, disease.
That's right. Especially the way that we reimburse products in the United States. I think we talked a little bit earlier about comparing curative therapies to more chronic use drugs. And like PCSK9 inhibitors and other drugs, the value of those are as you take them. And so we pay for those in a fee-for-service way per unit. So, the more drugs that are dispensed, that's how we pay for them, and then the value is, over a short duration of time. But with curative therapies in the current fee-for-service environment, it almost forces you to say, okay, if you're only going to pay one time, then you need to figure out what the value is over that patient's life, and then pay it all up front when that is administered. And that creates a lot of challenges, simple budgetary challenges for small and medium-sized payers, but also questions about, if you pay for it all up front, how long do you accrue those benefits and how do you factor that in?
Right, and how do you know if it's going to work after a year?
Right.
But you don't always have to pay up front. I mean, aren't there models where you pay, or there's thinking out there about models paying periodically?
Yeah, there are a number of examples in terms of value-based payment arrangements, which vary in the way that they're designed, all the way from value-based pricing or indication pricing based on clinical trial results, all the way to new payment models that really tie payment to the actual observed value. So as outcomes are demonstrated, or in the cases for gene therapies, as the benefits are durable and continue, the idea is perhaps we should pay as the drug continues to work. And that provides a lot of solutions to some of those challenges. Number one, if you pay over time as the drug works, then it reduces some of the short-term budgetary constraints, because you'd be paying a smaller amount over a longer period of time. But more importantly, it really does tie the payment to some of those uncertainties. So as the drug works, if you're a payer and you're concerned about the variability of the benefits or the durability of the benefits, it would create a more flexible mechanism to actually work with that payer and make sure that the payments are actually tied to the value that patients experience.
So normally on a panel like this, the payer and the drug maker, there'll be some tension. But I think on our prep call, Steve Miller from Express Scripts, when I asked him about the Novartis $475 price, I think he called it quite reasonable. So do you want to talk, Steve, about the pricing challenges? And I know that you guys haven't decided how you're going to deal with that, but you're working through it right now.
Yeah, so as you know, we've been very aggressive on drug pricing, and we call out when we see someone who we think is overpricing their drugs. Gene therapy is a totally different ballgame, and we're going to have to think about it differently. And so when you consider how you add this up, if you look at both cure rates in these kids and the cost of a stem cell transplant versus cure rates with the CAR T therapy and the cost of the CAR T therapy, there's not a big difference in cost, but a huge difference in outcomes. So you're talking about with stem cell transplant about a 50% cure rate. You're talking about with the CAR T therapy so far about a 90% cure rate. And so that's worth a premium in the marketplace. And when you look at how they've priced it above stem cell transplant, it's not that much more. And so I think Novartis has been pretty responsible in how they've approached this. And they're also working with us as they look at expanded marketplace. And so this is going to be a real challenge. So Sparks, for instance, you've seen the data or some of the examples of their eye product for Leber syndrome. This is spectacular, and what parent wouldn't want this? Their next product's going to be for hemophilia. Hemophilia costs the United States about $150,000 to $200,000 per patient per year. The medical offset for that one is really easy. But Greg brings up the problem. Do you pay for that all up front? Do you amortize it over the cost of years? How do you do value-based contracting? How do you have portability so if a patient changes one insurer to another over time? And so we're having to think through all these things, and we're working with Editas and Sparks and Novartis and others, because not only do we need a revolution in the science of the drug, we need a revolution in the science of reimbursement for drugs. And so this is a really exciting time. But we're all going to have to be in this together. We're going to need new regulations, new laws, but we're also going to need new payment systems to support what I think is the most exciting era in science that I've seen in 30 years.
Tom, do you want to jump in and talk about some of the challenges and sort of getting these products to the market and getting them funded?
Sure. You know, the science is incredibly exciting. I think the reason that it is because we have incentives in this country. We have a public policy environment in the United States mostly where that really fuels investment in this type of innovation and this type of research. The biotech companies that we represent at Bio, about 85% of them are small startups. They rely on angel investors, private venture capital, and that funds the vast majority of the cutting-edge clinical trials that we are seeing going around the world. 57% of all new products are actually developed here in the United States. So we really account for almost 60% of the entire world's production of new drugs. And that's because of the public policy environment. And so what we don't do is we don't try to create a cost-plus model in the United States where you try to total up the input costs. How much did it cost you to produce that particular drug? How much does it cost to manufacture it? And then we say, okay, you get an extra 10% on top of that. We don't do a cost-plus model in the United States. We allow the market to work out the value of those products based on incredibly aggressive negotiations by my good friend Steve Miller over here, who works with my member companies to try to come up with a fair price in the marketplace.
But what do you say? We don't have anyone on the panel making the argument, but there are some people at some I guess, patient groups that have said, you know, these drugs are priced too high. Yes, investors should get a return on their investment, but if you look at what happened in Europe, I mean, maybe that wasn't entirely a pricing issue, but it's great if you can cure leukemia, but if only 5 people can afford the drug or the system is only able to pay 5 people, I mean, right. What do you say to that?
And that's where we have to look at in the patient out-of-pocket costs, like Paul was mentioning. We have a system in this country that actually can, if we do it right, sustain the type of development that we've had over the years, including these very expensive products because they treat the smaller and smaller populations. So drugs are expensive. They're not going to get cheaper by any means. The era of precision medicine, I think, is going to continue this kind of sticker shock that we get sometimes. I think we're going to start to get used to that. What we have to figure out is how we make it accessible to patients, and that's through the types of payment system reforms that both Steve and Daniel have talked about. Bio completely supports those. Our member companies support a move towards value-based pricing arrangements. A lot of our companies are doing them. That's how we have to work with the insurance system in this country to make sure that they can absorb the costs in a reasonable manner and that they don't have to shift the costs to the patients. Patients have to get access to these products, and I think we can do that if we make some reforms to how we pay for drugs in this country.
So, but let me say, you know, we call out, when we see bad behavior by the pharmaceutical or biotech companies, we're going to continue to call that out. And so there are going to be companies that are going to price their products really inappropriately. What we saw with Novartis is, we had conversations with them leading up to their launch, and so they had an idea of where we stood on this, and we believe we actually modified their price. As you know, some of their investors thought they should have come out at a much higher price. The reality is that we're going to have to figure out what affordability really is, and that's actually pretty squishy. And as you heard from the previous speakers, it's in the eyes of the beholder. As a physician, as a patient, we want access to all products at no cost. That's not reality. And so the reality is we're going to have to work as a system, working with the biotech companies, with the payers, with the patient communities, and we're going to have to figure this out. But right now, the system is broken, and we haven't figured it out. So what we're charging, for instance, the co-pays for patients is not sustainable. And what the total cost
It's
of
too
the
low.
drug, rarely too low.
Yeah.
It's, this cost shifting to patients with high deductible health care, I always joke that, and it's not a joke, they're designed, high deductible health care is designed for rich people and sold to poor people. And so it really puts a lot of people in a bind. And so as we come out with these really expensive products, how are we going to develop a system that the patient has skin in the game, yet it's appropriate amount of skin in the game? And because I'll give you 2 examples. 2 gene therapies have been introduced in Europe, and both of them have essentially failed. This really is scary. So there was a drug, Libera, for lipoprotein lipase deficiency, something you've never heard of before. The gene drug worked. It cost $1.4 million. Because none of the payers in Europe would reimburse for it, the company has actually shut it down because they treated 1 patient outside the clinical trials.
Well, did they try dropping the price?
I'm not going to comment on their strategy, but the point is that even if they had treated everyone at that price, the company would never have recovered the research costs. The second one is Strimvelis. It's a drug for what most people think of as the bubble babies. It's the combined immune deficiency disease. And again, they're not getting anyone on the drug. And so we have got to figure it out in the United States and introduce these things better than they've done in Europe, because to choke off this science at this point in time would be a disaster for everyone.
Paul, from a patient point of view, how closely are you following? I know there's a hemophilia drug in the pipeline. I mean, as a patient with a novel therapy coming down the pike, I mean, how closely are you following it? And as an advocate, are you getting involved in talking about how the drug
Absolutely.
can be made available?
I definitely follow the development. I've talked to a lot of friends and colleagues in the community, and trying to understand, the experience of patients that are on the trials and what they're going through in taking the medications, and just kind of what is involved that surrounds that. I also follow, it's Spark is one, but others as well that are in those spaces. It's exciting all around and scary at the same time.
Yeah, I mean,
It brings a lot of
are you
questions to-
worried that you could be one of those people that can't afford it, or maybe can afford it for a year, or maybe
Well, I
you'll
guess that's one of the
lose your
worries. That
job,
there's
or-
others like, injury or death, or, just some of the challenges that come along with those fears of the unknown. I think they're constantly on my mind, and others in my position.
I know the current administration has made a novel deal on this drug with Novartis. Does anyone want to talk about that and the importance of that?
I would just say that I think at least it signals that the administration and CMS are open and willing to work with companies on novel value-based payment approaches. And so at Duke Margolis, we formed a new consortium that includes a range of stakeholders on these issues, including CMS. And that, plus this new announcement, does signal that the administration is open. There are concerns about drug prices, and it seems that looking at more value-based approaches and tying payment to actual outcomes is a direction that they're willing to go.
We've been trying to get CMS to do this for 2 years, so we're really excited to see that agreement. CMS needs to come out with some more safe harbors to let industry and the insurance industry and the PBMs know what kinds of deals will be acceptable. The government price reporting and payment reimbursement rules are incredibly complex. They're antiquated.
Yeah.
we're trying to pay for 21st century cures with a 20th century insurance and reimbursement system. It doesn't work. The government rules do not work. They actually stand in the way, if you can believe it. The rules around best price, the anti-kickback rules, which are supposed to prevent fraud in the marketplace, actually prevent things like a try before you buy approach, which actually is what Novartis is doing, right? They're going to only get paid if the product works, apparently. That's the deal with CMS. But they have to get special permission from CMS to actually even offer that in the marketplace. So that tells you how antiquated our government rules are in this space. We need to fix that if we want to move to a 21st century system.
So how can that happen? Does something have to go through Congress? Can rules be rewritten?
Both.
Okay.
So we've been doing this actually on the commercial side for quite a while. If you try, for instance, a TNF inhibitor for rheumatoid arthritis with our company, and in the first 90 days it doesn't work for you, you get 2/3 of the money back. And so we've been able to do these things for the last several years in the commercial marketplace. We have been to CMS, we've been to see both Tom Price, Seema Verma. They're actually really receptive to changing the marketplace. They want to see this for government programs also. And so this new deal actually is a big deal, because what they've done is, for the first time, they've said, yes, government programs can do value-based contracting. Now, they did it through CMMI, and so the question is this going to be reproducible? You know, what policies are going to need to change? You know, you've already mentioned several of them, but we're going to have probably new regulations, maybe even some new legislation to open this up. But if you want to pay for value, which we all want to do, so let's take the hemophilia product. One of the ways we've thought about it is, let's say it's $150,000 a year. Let's say they charge $1 million for the gene therapy. Wouldn't it be great if a payer, be it the patient or the health plan, paid $100,000 up front and $100,000 a year for the next 10 years? If the drug stopped working, you'd stop reimbursing the biotech company. So it would be value-based. They would have skin in the game. They would be taking risk also. But if you think about that, and they love it because it also evens out their cash flow. So they're not seeing big boluses of money and then no reimbursement in the out years. And so it's good for the patient, it's good for the payer, it's good because it's value-based, it's good for the manufacturer, and so it works for the system. But right now, there's no way in our system we can do this for government-paid patients.
Did you want to jump in?
Well, I completely agree. I think that those are a number of challenges. And if you look at, if you're in a volume-based world and you look how we currently pay for drugs, a lot of those make a lot of sense. Anti-kickback, even the best price, all of those make a lot of sense for volume-based reimbursement. The challenge is when you get to non-volume and more value-based, that's where all of these challenges come in, and even the way that the FDA regulates off-label communications. It makes it really challenging for a company to work with a payer or a provider and say, okay, we're going to base our payment off of these kinds of outcomes that you can measure in the ambulatory setting. Those outcomes that you can actually measure are unlikely to be the outcomes that were part of the clinical trial, and so therefore aren't in the indication. And that creates a challenge for manufacturers to work with payers around those outcomes, because they would be liable for off-label communication. And so a number of those challenges, not all of them require a legislative fix. Many of them require more regulatory clarity and regulatory changes. But it is something that the government seems to be willing to address.
Is there a partisan element to this? I mean, healthcare is obviously a very polarizing topic. I actually tried to look up the deal that you mentioned with Seema Verma and Novartis on my phone, and I couldn't find any news stories about it. Maybe there were. But, I mean, is this an area where people can come together? And, I mean, isn't CMMI, wasn't that created as part of the Affordable Care Act?
It was.
Okay.
It was.
So we have a Republican administration making this deal with Novartis. You know, when Seema Verma came in, there was some controversy about her and her ties to the private sector. Do you want to talk about that,
Well,
Tom?
there's absolutely common ground. In fact, Steve and I actually are part of a coalition that actually came up with a series of proposals, market-based proposals that Congress could enact and that the administration could enact, trying to increase competition both among brand companies but also with generics and biosimilars, reforms that we can do to speed competition in the marketplace. That's one way of bringing down prices. Steve's very good at negotiating once he's got some competing products on the market. to drive rebates and discounts, but also around value-based arrangements. We will need some legislation. We've got ideas around that, and this is a coalition, by the way, that has insurers, PBMs, drug companies, patient groups, consumer groups. It's a very broad-based coalition, and I encourage everybody to look at it and become a part of it.
What about on the FDA side? I think that they're having a meeting this week, actually. I think Duke is involved, looking at real-world evidence and
Right.
at new models for approving drugs when results come out later. What changes are going on there, and
Yeah, so
are they
that's,
moving fast enough?
They are. That was part of the 21st Century Cures Act and also part of the PDUFA 6 negotiation. So the idea is, as we know that real-world evidence, it can be generated. Every day that goes by, more and more providers and health systems are using electronic medical records, claims data, registry data, and able to collect a lot of outcomes attributed to patients that are pretty challenging to collect in clinical trials. But historically, the FDA hasn't been able to leverage that data in its drug approvals, and not necessarily just a new drug on the market, but even after the drug is on the market, there are a number of FDA decisions that happen in terms of updating the labeling, expanding the indication to new populations and new uses. And traditionally, companies would have to go back and design brand new clinical trials, which are really costly and time intensive. And so now the FDA with 21st Century Cures is recognizing that the real world data that's out there brings a lot of value, and there could be a lot of great information that's accrued that can lead to regulatory decisions. So we've been working with the FDA, and we have an event coming up this week around how can you use real world evidence for regulatory decisions, how you navigate the regulatory context and the clinical context to enable more information to go into the labeling at a lower cost, so that when patients are trying to make decisions and working with their providers to make decisions about therapies, they can look at the labeling and look at the indication and not just restricted to evidence that was developed during clinical trials, but actually evidence that accumulates as patients use these drugs.
We'll take a few questions in a few minutes, so if you have thoughts, start raising your hands. But I have to ask the panel about the debate over Obamacare repeal. I mean, is this impacted at all by any of the proposals that are out there? We don't have an insurer on the panel per se, but I mean, are they just apples and oranges? Or I mean, what can you say about how this discussion about gene-based therapy is impacted by the coverage debate? Sucks up so much of the oxygen.
It turns out that Obamacare actually didn't have a whole lot on how drugs are covered. And so this has actually been a hole in the marketplace, both with Obamacare and going forward. And so this is why the drug debate has actually been so vitriolic over the last couple of years. And I think we got to get to a better place, and I think we are. I think if you look at several of the launches in the recent past, I'll give you a couple examples. Regeneron brought a new drug to the market for atopic dermatitis. They were thinking about bringing it out similar to psoriasis treatment at $65,000. They ended up bringing it out at $37,500, half the price. Genentech has launched really a spectacular drug for multiple sclerosis, 25% cheaper than the market leader in that class. Radius brought a new drug out for osteoporosis, 40% cheaper than the market leader in that class. And so I think the debate has actually been heard. I think that the companies are trying to be responsible. If you look at actually drug trend over the last year, it's come down dramatically. In fact, specialty prices went up less last year than, you have to go back to 2003 for when specialty prices went up so little. And so I think the manufacturers are trying to be responsible. I think the debate is actually having a salient effect, but we still are, policy is really absent, and policy is really absent when it comes to gene therapy.
Do you have any questions from the audience in the back? If you could identify yourself and.
Yeah, I'm Aaron Trawick, Ascendance Biomedical. To the gentleman with bio, you mentioned that the prices aren't going to be going down anytime soon. And that, I mean, based on my understanding of non-AAV technology and its emergence in the gene therapy space right now, I mean, Novartis's price point, relatively high price point, which is novel is still based on AAV-type technology and is still based around reimbursing investors for clinical trial development for AAV-type technology, which is very expensive as compared to non-AAV technology. I mean, I can give you the case example of the Chinese researchers who recently cured lung cancer, you know, at about a $2 million price point, and how using non-AAV type technology can actually bring down that cost to less than $10,000 for clinical administration for a patient. And there's a litany of other examples where the clinician can actually be canceled out of the equation entirely. So I'm wondering, well, this doesn't seem like Bio is actually aware of that kind of coming down the pipe.
No, absolutely. As technology increases, costs will get cheaper to manufacture products like this. That's not the question. The reason that they're not going to get cheaper is because as you go into new areas, right, that is where the expense is. So, for example, we have thousands of clinical programs under development by our companies. As I said, about 70% of them are being led by small companies. That novel first-in-class type research that is going on is incredibly expensive, and it's trying to go after really hard problems. That problem is not going to get cheaper. Once people have figured out kind of how you do something, you're absolutely right. You can then figure out how you look at, genome sequencing, right? It's gone from being very, very expensive to very, very cheap now. That once you figure it out, the price will come down for those technologies. I'm talking about the broader ecosystem. We have thousands of diseases for which we have no idea how to treat or cure. So that's the problem I'm focused on, that our companies are focused on. That's not going to get cheaper.
Yeah, but you're exactly right. So I will, when you look at certain drugs, I'll give you a great example, hepatitis C, right? When Sovaldi came out, it was $1,000 a day. It was $84,000 for Sovaldi. You had to take it with ribavirin. The cost to cure was $140,000 per patient. Now, because of the subsequent addition of competitors to the marketplace, and you're exactly right, the cost of them doing their research dramatically lower, you can now treat hepatitis C effectively for around $25,000, which is actually cheaper than the old days of interferon and ribavirin, which didn't work very well at all. So I agree with you. I think that the biotech industries can often bring things to the marketplace at a markedly reduced price. And so we're going to have to actually look at this very seriously, because the question is, how much should it cost? How much should the patient have to take on? What is reasonable profitability for these companies? What's a reasonable return to shareholders and to investors? All those things have to be taken into account, but the technologies themselves have to come down, and we got to get more treatments out there at lower costs. There will be exceptions. There's going to be these tiny populations that are going to be really expensive. But, the vast majority of us have a lot of common diseases, and we need to bring the cost of those treatments down, like diabetes, hypertension, hypercholesterolemia, and we got to have better outcomes. So we have to move to a value-based system, just not a volume-based system.
Any other questions? Yeah, I thought it was interesting that you made that point, Tom, about how prices aren't going down, because it's sort of like the unpleasant reality. But if it means more cures, then I don't think, the patient would argue with that. I mean,
it's just a function of the business model, right? Steve and the questioner are exactly right. Over time, as we learn more about how to do this stuff, the prices will come down for those technologies that we've learned a lot about. I'm talking about the ones that are on the cutting edge, where we're still trying to figure it out. And they are for smaller and smaller, more targeted populations. And so the numbers just don't work. You look at the cost to develop a drug by Tufts University, that I've looked at this for decades, it's doubled since 2003.
Well, that could be the topic of a whole other panel.
Right. But the point is that the science is getting harder, the regulatory systems are getting harder, the insurers are demanding more and more information, as they should, about the effectiveness of these products. So I'm just trying to level set. I don't want people to think that that prices are all of a sudden going to come way down. They're not, because the business model itself doesn't lend itself to that.
All right. Well, it's a good reality check. Well, I want to thank you all for taking the time this morning in an area where there's promise and some agreement, which is a nice thing to have in Washington for a change. And I'll turn it back over to you.
Thank you so much. Thanks to Kim and our panelists. This brings us to the end of our program. On behalf of the Hill and Spark Therapeutics, I'd like to thank you for joining us. If you missed any portion of the event, it will be on thehill.com later today. And as a reminder, please do fill out your feedback forms. Thanks so much. Have a great rest of your day.